Hello and welcome to Reflections, a program produced under the auspices of Paducah Cooperative Ministries. On this program, we have gathered a panel of ministers to discuss various chapters and verses in the Bible and to see how we interpret those chapters from our various traditions. Today's panel, we have Father Brian Johnson from St. Francis de Sales Catholic Church here in Paducah and also Rosary Chapel. And then next to him is Brother Dan Owen from Broadway Church of Christ here in Paducah also. My name is Brian Cope, and I'm pastor of the United Church of Paducah, United Church of Christ here in Paducah. Now today, we want you to get out your Bibles. You can see we all have ours out and open, ready to go. And we are going to discuss the story that you're probably all familiar with, but we want to look at it more carefully. And that is the story of Cain and Abel. And you'll find this in the book of Genesis, chapter 4. Now, we all probably are using different translations, so I just want to say from on the panel we're using different translations. I'm using what's called the New Revised Standard Version translation, and I think, Father Brian, you're using it too.
Yes, I'm using the same.
And Dan, what?
I'm using the New International Version.
The New International Version, okay. So we encourage you, in fact, we really invite you to take out your Bible, open it up to this, so you can read along as we discuss the story. Now, this is in chapter 4, and I'm going to start this out by asking you both to just give me your feelings, your thoughts about what you think jumps out. What jumps out of this story for you? What themes, maybe what problems, what issues, what do you find as you read this story again that jumps out to you as far as significant aspects?
You know, to me, I would probably introduce any comments that I would have on the story of Cain and Abel with, in a sense, we just have part 2, you know, or volume 2 of this continuing drama of sin in the lives of humans in regard to, you know, the continuing story of our eventual or potential fall from grace and sin creeping into the world. In a sense, also, you've got the twofold expression that we saw that had its start and origin in Adam and Eve and their sin against God. Now we just have the second part, the sin against one's brother or sister in Cain taking the life of Abel. So again, I'd preface any comments with the fact that it is a story about life and the sanctity of life and the respect for not only acknowledging God's role, but now even the role of our brothers and sisters as equal sons and daughters of God, created in God's image and likeness, you know, which is going to tie in the life thing to, you know, against the prohibition of, or for the prohibition of taking life.
Okay.
But in general, we've got the continuing saga here of humanity's search for right relationship, not only with God, but also with one another.
Okay. Okay. Dan?
I believe that also that it is the story of sin. Man sins against God in chapter 3, and he sins against his fellow man in chapter 4. That's certainly the fundamental theological thing going on here. It also is the first human attempt to worship God, and I think that's very important to look at. And it does deal with the sanctity of life. I think all three of those things are important themes in the chapter.
Okay. Okay. What I find in this chapter, and in you know, in addition to what you both have said, is that it produces, I think, some interesting questions for me about our relationship with God, and the fact that questions about our worship, for example. Now, what jumps out when I read this story, it's just one of the stories in the Bible for me that jumps out, is that the first question, and that is, what was wrong with Cain's offering? Now, in the story, Cain and Abel both bring an offering. Cain is the, I want to make sure I don't mess this up. Cain is the tiller of the ground, and Abel is the one who is like the cowboy, the rancher. He has the flocks. So he brings the first fruit of his flocks, and it says, and the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. And so this sets the whole thing. Now, what do you think's going on here? I'll get your opinions before I give mine, but
Yeah, as I reflected on this text, one of the first questions that came to me was, I really wonder if, you know, in the phrasing, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard, I wonder if maybe we haven't loaded this text down with the judgment against Cain's offering, whereas maybe, you know, I mean, would that necessarily be implied? Perhaps he was just, on this particular day, favoring the offering of Abel. And the reason I say that is because later in the story then, when the dialogue continues between Cain and Abel, it seems to be, anyway, that God instructs Cain not to, you know, when he talks about sin lurking at his door, you know, not to allow this to, in a sense, don't judge that from my actions you're condemned. You know, as if to say, you know, one would have to then ask the history of Cain and Abel and these different offerings. But was this the first day that Abel had ever offered? So in a sense, do we have a situation similar to something that's going to occur in the New Testament with, for example, the prodigal son story, that we've got really, what if this was the bringing on board of Cain in worship, of Abel in worship?
Okay.
So.
An interesting point. Dan?
I really believe that there's precedent here for acceptable and unacceptable worship. The reason for looking at it this way is that right after this, when the Lord rejects Cain's offering in verse 6, the Lord questions him much as he questioned Adam and Eve after their sin in the in chapter 3. He says, "Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted?" This implies to me that he had not done what was right and therefore was not accepted. And in the New Testament, in Hebrews 11:4, it says, "By faith Abel offered unto God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain." And if you look at the rest of Hebrews 11, by faith Abraham obeyed to go out. You know, by faith he offered up Isaac. And those were all cases in which God had commanded them what to do. And when they did what God commanded, they were accepted. And I think the implication here is that Cain and Abel had been given, though we don't have it written down, instruction as to what to do in worship to God, or how to do it. And Cain had not complied, and Abel had.
Yes.
Therefore, he was accepted.
Yes. It's, and I think that's a very good point to point out, is that the key is in what God asks, you know, as that, you know, if you've done right, you know, and I want to use the words that he uses here, if you do well, will you not be accepted? Well, obviously, if the text tells us it wasn't accepted, then the implication is that something was wrong there.
There's another passage also in 1 John chapter 3 where it says that Cain was of the evil one and he murdered his brother. Of course, that refers to the later part of the discussion about the murder.
Right.
But it says, because the murder was because his works were evil and his brothers were righteous. That seems to me to say that out of the experience of their worship and one being accepted and one being rejected, that's why he turned around and murdered his brother.
Okay. So you would you disagree then with the commentator that I was reading as I was studying for this passage, who suggested that maybe God had set the whole thing up, that this, you know, that we're too, as he said, we may be too hard on Cain here and not hard enough on God. And that...
Oh, I disagree with him strenuously.
I thought it was an interesting point of view. But his argument is that the text does not bear out that Cain did anything wrong. So it's...
Also, and I want to hear what Brian has to say about this, but later in the Pentateuch, animal sacrifice was given by God as the way that atonement was made for sin. Of course, you've already pointed out this is about sin. And in Leviticus 17:11, he says, "The life of the flesh is in the blood. I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls." And Abel did bring a blood sacrifice here, and Cain did not. Of course, when Noah and Abraham offered sacrifices later on, they bring blood sacrifices. So that leads me to believe God must have told them something about that.
Yes. Well, I was just saying, and then there's another way you could take this too, and that is that God prefers farmers over ranchers.
I thought one interesting note was if you just looked at like socioeconomic classes and all that. I mean, we've got 3 here, so in a sense we could read back and say, is this just the establishment or explanation or account for you know, different strata of making a living and all? Because you've got with Cain and Abel, you've got the you know, the shepherding or the pastoral lifestyle, and then the agricultural or horticultural. And then you have afterward another expulsion, you know, again, much like Adam and Eve, you've got another expulsion, and then he kind of becomes a hunter-gatherer, you know, one that just feeds whatever the land provides, you know, feeds on.
I personally find it just beautiful how this story parallels the story of the fall of Adam and Eve. I mean, it just throughout the whole thing, it's almost as if you know, you could put them side by side and they would just match each other almost beautifully.
Let's talk about that for our listeners, because really structurally the text, when Adam and Eve sin, back in chapter 3, God comes to them and says, where are you? Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree? And here in this chapter, when Cain sins by offering unacceptable worship, I think, verse 6, he comes and says, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? And he questions Cain just as he questioned Adam and Eve to make Cain face what he did, just like he made Adam and Eve face what they did and the consequences that they had to pay for it.
Right. And in that same verse, there's an interesting parallel, and if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. What I want to point out to our viewers is that that phrase, its desire is for you, is only taken up 2 other places in the whole Bible, and that is one in the I think it's 2. Let me go back and find it here. In the story of Adam and Eve, in chapter 3, verse 16, to the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. And then here's the phrase, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And then it's brought up again, and interestingly enough, in the Song of Solomon. And those are the only 3 places that this phrase, your desire shall be for your husband. Here, its desire is for you, but you must master it. And it's the same. It's the same in each case. It refers to desire and then some relationship where one person is ruling over another in all 3 of the instances. I just think that's a very interesting parallel that we make here between now this is Cain and sin, as opposed to Eve and Adam. And Adam's going to rule over. But what he says to Cain is that Cain has to master or rule over sin, which is sin shall desire for you. So what do you think of, one of the things that comes out at this point too for me is this whole question of original sin. Now, one scholar who was talking about this said that this verse in itself proves that we're not dealing with original sin, because God gives Cain the choice to be a master over sin. Do you see that? It's, or I guess I should ask how you feel about original sin.
Well, I would back up. You know, I wonder about, to kind of tag on to something you said earlier about the God's preference for, you know, if that's not analogous to the placement of a tree that's forbidden, you know, again, so you would wonder where's the source of the temptation here.
Right.
Okay, so just having said that, you know, I mean, certainly I would see this coupled right alongside the fall story, and so in a sense, yeah, I see that, yeah, original sin is shot through this passage. You know, I mean, it's shining through. You know, so that I would say yes, it is certainly here. So I don't know exactly who the fault is being attributed to.
Yeah, it's
well, I'll take the other side of the coin here, I guess. I do not think that we're talking about original sin, and I think that each person chooses to sin or not sin, and this verse is an example of that. one of the classic texts, Romans 5:12, that comments on Genesis. Just as through one man sin came into the world and death by sin, then the last part of the verse says, so death passed to all men, for that all sinned.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say because that he sinned, it says because that they sinned, all sinned. And the all sinned in Romans 5:12 is the same as Romans 3:23. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Mm-hmm. Every person, when they sin, they become a participant in it, and every person eventually does.
Uh-huh.
And so really it comes out in many respects the same way, but I do see that this passage is about desire and its function in temptation. James 1:13-14, God doesn't tempt, but every man's tempted when he's drawn away by his own lust. Mm-hmm. Lust, when it's conceived, brings forth sin, and sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death. Mm-hmm. So Cain didn't master it. He messed up.
Yes.
Got jealous and killed his brother.
Do you find that, is there any hint in this passage that perhaps Adam and Eve share in Cain's culpability? I'll tell you why I'm saying that, because I'm going back to the original Hebrew for the word Cain, which means to get or to create. And so the very name Cain is a name of potential creation. But Abel means nothingness, void. And now in that little, just that little phraseology of how they named them, does this say something about Adam and Eve's relationship with Cain and Abel, that they would name Cain, give Cain such a potential, or a name full of potential, and then name their second son nothingness or void? So, I don't know if you've ever thought about that or not. Mm-hmm. But
yeah, I think really that, to me, what's so central about these passages is the whole question of life and who. Mm-hmm. I mean, life is God's. And if you look at the case of here of Cain taking the life of Abel, or if you look at the Adam and Eve account where we have, okay, on the way to the tree of eternal life is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And what scared the Elohim was, will they be wanting life next? You know, and so the thing here, to me, it's the theme of life. And so in this case, one wonders when the human family comes on the scene of realizing their role in procreation or generativity, if we don't have a similar situation here with Eve's comment saying, I have produced with the help of the Lord. Okay, with the help of the Lord, but at the beginning there's the singular, you know, I. Yes. And so if we don't have maybe the setup here of who's producing life, and then would that then naturally fall over to Cain of, you know, I was the one begotten, you know, by, and then the whole thing then of taking life in his own hands and then not feeling, you know, that connection of life with his brother. So to me, that just kind of reinforces that whole theme of life and life being God's. And then you know, so again, if we, in the face of God, sin against not acknowledging God as the creator of all life, then the next step would be taking that out in our relationship to one another and freely taking the lives of others, again, with no remorse there. With no remorse. It's just I mean, to me, it's the second drop of the second shoe dropped, that here we've got disregard for God's place as creator, and then that opens the door to taking the lives of others freely. Right. And that's an interesting point, that he shows no remorse. Even when he's punished, he shows no remorse for what he did.
Brian, another thing that strikes me as interesting is back in 3:15 in this prophetic statement, he says, he's talking to Satan, to the serpent. He said, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. And in the Genesis text, I think the next chapter is about Satan's offspring and the woman's offspring, Cain being Satan's offspring, and Abel being the woman's offspring in this sense. Abel was the righteous one, and Cain was the wicked one in the vein of the serpent. And if you go to the end of the chapter, at 4:25 and 26, Adam lay with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in the place of Abel. See, not in the place of Cain.
Yes.
but in the place of Abel. Abel is the seed of the woman, the righteous one, and Cain is the seed of the serpent, the wicked one.
Yes.
And the prophecy says that eventually the righteous will overcome the wicked, you know, and this becomes the kind of the theme line of the rest of the story of Genesis in the Bible.
Well, and something to, I think, in this passage that, I mean, this chapter that plays that out too, is that to see where Cain's potential came into, I mean, ultimately comes out in this interesting and strange little story we have in verse 23 of Lamech. And it's, I mean, sometimes, and when I first read this, I thought, what does this story have to do with anything? But the more you read it, the more you see that it's this potential, you know, the potential of sin, and it culminates.
Do you mean like what Cain did to his brother? Lamech does the same thing later? Or?
Yeah, well, Lamech, he's descended from Cain, and so then he stands up and he says, if Cain is avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 77-fold, meaning that I can do whatever I want to. And then, in the New Testament, Jesus takes this whole chapter and turns the whole thing around when someone asks him, how many times should I forgive someone who sinned against me? He comes back and quotes this, 70 times 7, you know, and to me it's a very nice way of undoing everything that the culmination of Cain comes to do in a very symbolic way. But it's...
I know, to me that raises the question too of the mark of Cain, you know, the God's protection of Cain, and then, you know, one would perhaps, if we sat in our courtrooms today, wonder, well, where's the justice? Unless, again, the theme is life, and God is establishing the prohibition of the taking of life, as if to say, let us stop this here, and then my divine grace, you know, God's divine grace steps in and places a mark on Cain to not let this be perpetuated, you know, as if to stop it in its tracks here.
Yeah, I take this back to the parallel with Adam and Eve, and because the question comes out to me in Adam and Eve in the fall, why didn't God just kill them? He told them that's what was going to happen. They took from the tree of knowledge of life, they would die. So why didn't he kill them and start all over? You know, it could have been easy. In fact, there's myths all out. I don't know if you've run across them, but there's myths in which the possibility that maybe he did recreate, you know, and start all over from scratch. But he didn't, and he doesn't with Cain either. I mean, it would be easy to say, okay, you took your brother's life, and now you're going to have to pay your own life for it.
In the theme of mercy, which you all are touching on in different ways, God does have mercy on Cain to some degree here, even though later he tells Noah after he comes out of the ark, whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, and institutes the death penalty. But in this story of Abel's blood, a phrase that jumps out at me, he says, the voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. And of course, Abel's blood was crying out for retribution, for vengeance. But in Hebrews 12:24, when it talks about the blood of Christ, it says his blood speaketh better things than that of Abel. Meaning as Abel's blood cries out for vengeance, the blood of Christ for all of us cries out for grace and mercy. So I think that that's a theological truth that comes out of this that lasts through the rest of the Bible.
Yes, yes.
While sin demands consequence, God is not only just but merciful, and he wants to have mercy on us in Jesus.
What do you make of the fact that this is the first theme that runs throughout the Old Testament, and it, to a certain sense picked up in the New Testament, and that is the older brother, the rivalry between the older brother and the younger brother. We're going to see it in Jacob and Esau. We're going to see it in the story of Joseph. You've already mentioned the prodigal son. Why do you think the Bible is so interested in this relationship? Older brother, younger brother, rights and...
I wonder if it's not like, in a sense, is God's revelation of an archetypal preference for the weak or the poor, in the same way the Israelite community will be so concerned about the foreigner, the outsider, the widow, the poor. So also then, a sense here, kind of the establishment of what Jesus is going to proclaim fully, like in Matthew 5, the Beatitudes, the whole thing of God's preferential option for the poor. You know, God's preference for those who cannot stand for their own self. And then the need then for us to step in and acknowledge our brotherhood and sisterhood with them, identify with them, one family, and therefore come to their aid. lifting the lowly to high places, etc. So.
Identify with those who are named nothing, you know,
Exactly.
like or void, like Abel was. Do you agree, or?
I've never really thought about it. I notice what you're talking about, and it's true. There is quite a bit of that. I've just never really thought about it, so I don't really know the answer that I would give. So I'll just pass on that.
Okay. Well, we'll bring it up when we get to another story about brother versus brother. The one thing I think is interesting too is that, and you had mentioned the passage in the first letter of John, the 3rd chapter. Around passage he talks about Abel, but he talks about brotherly love as being the love of the resurrection, and I would just refer our listeners to look that up. I mean, I'm not going to read it for you. Look it up because it's very and about who hates the one who hates their brother is the one who is subject to death, but the one who is subject to resurrection is the one who loves the brother. And I think this just comes back into, am I my brother's keeper? You know, and the resolution is, to me, in the New Testament, is that yes, we are. There's no way getting around it.
In that question, I find that interesting contextually, because in verse 9 here in Genesis 4, the Lord says to Cain, "Where is your brother?" Well, God knew where his brother was. This is like chapter 3 when he's trying to get him to own up to what he's done. But he says, I don't know, am I my brother's keeper? It's simply a skirting of the issue, an avoidance of the responsibility for a sin. And really contextually, what we make out of that phrase, you know, we're all supposed to be our brother's keeper, really isn't there in the context. It's just simply Cain's way of avoiding responsibility for his sin.
In the same way Adam and Eve passed the buck, this is a kind of a passing the buck. Is that because the suggestion is am I my brother's keeper? Well, he could possibly throw it back to God. You should know where he is. I mean, it's not my responsibility; it's your responsibility for keeping track of Abel. And so now I may be reading too much into what.
But see, then God comes back and says to him, knowing full well where his brother is, "What have you done?" See, that's more direct. The first one is, "Where is your brother Abel?"
That's right.
But the second one puts his nose right to the grindstone. What have you done?
It's almost like he allows us the opportunity to confess.
To confess.
And I think that's interesting. And we're going to end on there because they just told me we are out of time. So I don't know what that'll leave our viewers with, but we thank you for joining us, and we'll continue. Our next show we'll ask you to look for will be on the passage from the New Testament. And we thank you, and if you have any questions at all, we invite you to direct them to us by way of Reflections, 4600 Buckner Lane, Paducah, Kentucky, 42001. Thank you.